Hey, Sparkle here. If your Sparkle is 160 plus speed, congratulations, but if she is not 160 speed, your build is not trash. Today I'll be explaining Sparkle's speed goals, how they work, why we go for them, and why they don't necessarily matter. I already gave speed goals in my previous video, but sometimes people take the values too seriously, so I'm here to help stop that and look more in depth into these values. So like and sub if this helped, and let's begin. Sparkle has three ways of building her speed. You can first go one speed behind your DPS for what we call a -1 speed Sparkle or a slow Sparkle. You can then go as much speed as possible with a DPS with no speed for what we call a fast Sparkle. And then you can go for a specific speed breakpoint with the danced light cone and the eagle set, min-maxing the amount of actions you can take in a certain amount of cycles. The first two, slow and fast Sparkle, are standard and can be built wherever. The third playstyle is for low cycle clears in endgame content. Whether you run behind the DPS or way ahead, your Sparkle will still perform well. It just depends on what you prefer, what gear you have, or how the DPS prefers to be played. So let's learn why we go for certain speeds on fast Sparkle. Right now, most guides, including my own, recommend going for 160 as a goal, but a goal isn't a must. Let's see why 160 is recommended. Now, if you don't understand speed or cycles, well, I do have a guide on that, and an amazing speed guide came out recently from Sweetly. I won't go fully in depth on speed today, I will try to explain as simply as possible. Your speed determines your action value, which will tick down until you take your turn. Having more speed means a smaller action value, which will thus tick down sooner than a higher action value, giving you your turns faster and sooner. Your speed is rounded down visually in game, but speed has decimals which can be important, and you can see them on a website like Anchor HSR. Cycles are a cluster of 100 action value, and the very first cycle is 150 action value long. They will tick down just like your units do. Cycles appear in some events and sometimes in Simulated Universe, but where they're most important is in Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction, which always use cycles. Cycles are why we have speed breakpoints 99% of the time. So what we want is to have a speed high enough that gives us a low enough action value to act multiple times within these cycles. The first cycle is 150 AV long. If you want to act twice in 150 AV, we thus need an AV of 75 or under, which gives us the common speed breakpoint of 133.4 or 134 speed. If we clear before this first cycle, which has 150 AV, we have then done a 0 cycle. The second cycle ends at 250 AV, giving us a 1 cycle clear if we defeat the enemies before it ends. If we want to act 4 times in the first 2 cycles, that means we want to act 4 times in 250 action value, which means we want Sparkle's AV to be 62.5, which gives us the other popular breakpoint of 160 speed, and this speed is too high to recommend on most units. This is, however, the origin of 160 or 161 speed Sparkle. And that brings us to our first point. 160.1 speed or 161 speed is actually unnecessary for a solo Sparkle, and this goes for any support aiming for 160. As long as you have at least 160 speed visually in game, you are safe, even at 160.000 speed. If you tie your AV with the Cycle's AV, it works in favor of your unit, as demonstrated by Kanahira's run here with their 160 speed attack % boot Sparkle, and I have no idea how they managed to pull this one off. So now that we know that 160 is the breakpoint, do we actually need it? Breakpoints are beneficial but not mandatory. If you do not clear when the breakpoint allows you to take another action, then the breakpoint is not useful. I could take 4 actions in 2 cycles at 160 speed, but if I still can't clear, then I never needed 160 speed in the first place. It is for that specific 2 cycle breakpoint giving us a 1 cycle clear. And if you clear before the breakpoint even matters, then the breakpoint again is not useful. For example, if I clear the first wave in 0 cycles, I only needed the 134 speed breakpoint, not the 161. Furthermore, Memory of Chaos has 2 waves, so breakpoints can work for one wave but not the other, or they can work for both waves if you're lucky. When you clear a wave and enter a new one, all AV resets, including your own. So we get a brand new first cycle of 150 AV. And we have to clear in 5 cycles a side for maximum stars if both sides are balanced. And since AV resets on a new wave, we have a free 150 AV cycle at the start of both waves. So you could clear the first wave in 0 cycles and then still have 5 for the second wave. Or you get a 1 cycle 4 cycle split. Or you get a 2 cycle 3 cycle split. You can even go faster and let the second team have more cycles to clear, which is important for Memory of Chaos where one side is much more difficult. So instead of only looking for a 1 cycle clear, aka the first 2 cycles, we want to look at more than that. 134 speed can help us for a potential 0 cycle clear. 160 speed is for that 1 cycle clear as usual, 142 speed for a 2 cycle clear, and then depending on how fast we cleared the first wave, we then have a certain amount of cycles left if we want 3 stars. 3 cycle clear sees us only wanting 156, a 4 cycle clear 146 speed, and for a 5 cycle clear we can be at 153 speed. 160 is above all of them, sure, but 160 is also way above some of them in speed requirements, being unnecessarily high. If I simulate a generic DPS's damage with Sparkle at 160 speed for 350 AV, aka 3 cycles or a 2 cycle clear, then the damage result is the same when we drop Sparkle all the way down to 143 speed, because 160 does not grant a bonus action in this cycle. The way 160 speed would help is to do a 1 cycle clear on a wave. This can help you get a 1 to 4 cycle split on Memory of Chaos and give you comfort in a 1 to 3 cycle split, as you are also above 156 speed. You also have to consider the fact that some Memory of Chaos stages can be lopsided in difficulty, and you might need to do 6 cycles one side and 4 cycles on the other, again skewing your breakpoints. Now, when considering pure fiction, new waves do not reset your AV and you have a 4 cycle limit, so 450 AV. With 450 AV also being important for a 3 cycle second wave clear in Memory of Chaos, this is the breakpoint we should be looking at more, and that is 156 speed rather than 160. It's 2 speed subsets less and still high, but still easier to obtain at 10 average speed subsets with Hacker 2Bs and speed boots. The important part of fast Sparkle is being fast enough to give more actions than a DPS could dream of, whilst also letting them go attack percent or HP percent boots. So to summarize, how fast should my Sparkle be? Well, the minimum in my opinion is 133.4 or 134 speed. This also works as slow Sparkle's desired speed, so you don't have to swap relics. Then we can see some notable speed breakpoints after that. 141 is important for Genuine players, as that is the minimum you want to be on Sparkle for Genuine to take 2 actions each Lightning Lord. It is also just behind a base speed Zealer after her skill's speed buff. Without considering Eagle Set and Dance Dance Dance, I'd say 163.7 is the maximum you should consider on a fast Sparkle. Now onto the other speed setups which aren't part of what the video was explaining, but here as a recap so you don't feel betrayed. For slow Sparkle, -1 speed behind your DPS is the way to go. For normal characters, you should be 134 speed easily on Sparkle, and the only problem is if your DPS is too slow for 135 speed. You can go a tiny bit lower in some cases, but if your DPS is way too slow, just drop their speed completely and go for a fast Sparkle. For Dance plus Eagle Set, those have specific speed breakpoints and they can see you going to speed values even higher than 163. I have some speed breakpoints in my main guide. If you want a Sparkle acting as if she had 200 speed, you'd want 167.4 speed with her on the Wind set, and you'd want a second harmony with Dance S5. Dance S5 on Sparkle herself means the DPS doesn't get boosted since she wants to ult on the DPS's turn, and she will take 3 actions in the first cycle, but the DPS will not be able to. This is solved with the second harmony having it. This speed can change depending on other allies, speed buffs, more dance light cones, and is something you specifically calculate. When on basic spam Sparkle, you should just go as high as possible. You don't need a specific speed breakpoint, you just want to generate skill points. But don't go too high either if you want a 2-turn ult rotation with an abundance that is going quid pro quo or shared feeling. They'll need to be tuned or somewhat close in speed depending on the light cone. When tuned with Bronya and skilling on both, you should have them tuned quite close by. Sparkle being first is ideal, but Bronya being first is okay too if they are tuned close together. There are setups that can change this, but explaining every single tiny niche is a bit too much. So the speed of these two can be 135 Sparkle, 134 Bronya, or 161 Sparkle, 160 Bronya. Again, the 160 is not necessary, but if you're using both of these units, you should be low cycle clearing, so 160 is more important than usual and is very big for those 1 cycle clears. So the next time you see someone struggling with their build or new to the game, be nice to them, guide them, and think a bit, rather than imposing 160 speed when they might not 1 cycle clear anyway. It is hard to achieve even in the late game and doesn't necessarily matter. Thanks to my amazing YouTube members, thanks for watching and have a Guoba day.